Story number 1. The Lost Trail, Yosemite National Park. Lena and Tom had always been the adventurous type. A hike in Yosemite National Park, they thought, would be the perfect way to break free from the chaos of the city. The trail they picked was marked as easy, a scenic route that promised stunning views of the towering granite cliffs, the winding river, and the sprawling pines. It seemed like the kind of hike that anyone, even a beginner, could enjoy. The morning was crisp and clear when they set out, the sun casting long shadows through the trees as they stepped onto the path. They talked and laughed, exchanging stories of their childhoods and dreams of the future. The trail was as peaceful as they had imagined, a soft, well-worn dirt path lined with thick brush. But something felt off. They couldn't put their finger on it at first, just a vague sense that the air around them was heavier somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As they continued, Lena noticed that the trees around them seemed different. At first, it was subtle, an oak here, a pine there, but after a while the changes became more obvious. The trees were closer now, their gnarled branches leaning over the path, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground beneath their feet had softened, the soil becoming spongy and damp. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The map had shown a wide, open trail with no dense woods. Tom frowned and pulled out his phone to check the GPS. The signal was weak, flickering on and off, but the map didn't match the landscape at all. They were no longer following the path they had started on. The trail had shifted, as if the park itself was playing a cruel joke. "Maybe we missed a turn?" Lena suggested, her voice tight with concern. But Tom shook his head. "No, this doesn't feel right. I think we should turn back." They retraced their steps, but the deeper they went, the more the world around them seemed to twist and warp. The trail wasn't where it should have been. The trees, once spaced apart, had crowded closer together, their bark darker and smoother. The path was now a muddled mess, as if the land itself had swallowed the trail whole. They were walking in circles, and no matter which way they turned, they found themselves back in the same place. A thick fog had begun to settle in, swirling around their ankles like cold, wet hands. The world beyond the mist was a blur, just dark shapes that loomed and shifted. Tom's heart was pounding in his chest now. The laughter and easy conversations had died between them. Now, all that was left was a gnawing sense of dread. Suddenly, they heard something. A whisper. At first, it was faint, just a rustle in the fog, but then it became clearer, sharper. Names, their names, spoken in hushed tones by a voice that wasn't their own. Lena stopped dead in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. Tom grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I heard it," she whispered back, looking around desperately, but all she could see were shadows in the mist. The trail had disappeared altogether, leaving only the twisted trees and the oppressive fog. They kept walking, though every step felt heavier, more labored. But the whispering didn't stop. It seemed to be getting closer, surrounding them, filling the space between their heartbeats. And then they saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the edge of their sight. It wasn't clear, not really. It flickered in and out of the fog, like a shadow playing tricks on their eyes. But there was something about it. Something wrong. It was watching them, standing still as the world around it twisted. "Who's there?" Tom shouted, his voice shaking now. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. But they both knew it was watching them. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps as they backed away, trying to find any hint of the trail, any sign of the world they had once known. But the forest seemed to close in around them, trapping them. The mist thickened, and the trees grew taller, their branches reaching down like hands, dragging at their hair and clothes. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Their names were being called over and over until it felt like the very air was suffocating them. And then they saw more of them. Figures, all around them now, standing in the fog. They were everywhere. Some were standing tall, their features hidden by the mist. Others were crouched low, their eyes glowing faintly. The shapes moved, but never too close, always keeping their distance just out of reach. Their whispering was now a constant hum, an unholy chorus that seemed to come from the earth itself. Lena and Tom ran. They didn't know where they were running, only that they had to get away. They could hear the heavy sound of their own footsteps, the thumping of their hearts in their ears, but the figures followed, always behind them, always just beyond the veil of fog. But no matter how far they ran, the trail never led them out. The park was endless, an ancient thing that had no intention of letting them go. The more they tried to escape, the more they felt the weight of something older, something that had been here long before them, something that fed on the lost. It wasn't until the last whisper reached their ears that they understood. The figures in the fog were not there to hurt them. They were there to guide them, to keep them lost. And in the end, they were just two more souls that the park had claimed. The fog swallowed them whole. The lost trail remained, empty and waiting for the next pair of footsteps to wander too far. Story number 2. The Whistler's Watch, Great Smoky Mountains National Park. There's an old story in the Smoky Mountains, a story whispered among the locals, passed down like a curse. They talk about the Whistler, a man who vanished into the depths of the forest decades ago, and how his presence still haunts the park year after year. Some say he was just a man who got lost. Others say he was more, something darker, something that never really left. The myth goes like this. Every year, usually in the fall when the air turns crisp and the fog rolls in thick over the hills, campers hear it. A faint sound, almost like the wind, but not quite. A low, eerie whistling. It's soft at first, like a tune carried by the breeze, but the more you listen, the more it gets under your skin. Some folks have claimed to hear it close by, just outside their tents. Some have even been brave, or foolish, enough to venture into the woods, trying to find where it's coming from. But no one ever comes back. And so, the story continues, told around campfires, to warn the curious or the reckless. That was how it all began for Alex, Sarah, and Ben. They weren't from the area, just a trio of friends eager for a weekend getaway in the Smokies, far away from the noise of the city. They'd heard the rumors, of course, but they laughed it off. Campers hear all kinds of things in the woods, right? Wind through the trees, animal calls, the creaking of branches. Nothing that would make them believe in local legends. The first night was quiet. They made camp, built a fire, and sat around it, talking and laughing as the shadows of the trees grew long and dark. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, but they didn't mind. There was no sign of the weather turning bad, and the sky was clear. They hadn't expected much excitement on their trip, just a peaceful escape. But then, as the night wore on, Alex heard it. A faint whistle. At first, he thought it was just the wind, something natural. But the longer he listened, the more it stood out. It wasn't the wind, it was too deliberate, too purposeful. His skin prickled. He turned to Sarah and Ben, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were busy poking at the fire, chatting about something trivial. "Did you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Ben replied without looking up. "That whistling." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been out in the woods too long. It's probably just an animal." But Alex didn't think so. He stood up slowly, scanning the trees around them. The whistle came again, fainter this time, as though someone was far off, hidden in the dark. He didn't know why, but something about it tugged at him. He grabbed his flashlight. "I'm going to see what it is," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. "No way," Sarah protested. "Are you crazy? It's probably nothing." "I'll be quick," Alex insisted, already moving toward the edge of their campsite. Ben shrugged and took a swig from his water bottle, disinterested, but Sarah looked at him with concern. "Don't go too far," she warned, her voice tinged with unease. Alex smiled, trying to reassure her, but deep down, a part of him felt strange. He didn't want to admit it, but there was something unsettling about that sound. He pushed it aside, telling himself he was just being paranoid. As he walked farther from the camp, the whistle grew louder. It was unmistakable now, a soft melody drifting on the cool night air. The trees loomed close, their branches tangled and dark, as if reaching out to pull him deeper into the woods. The sound seemed to echo off the trunks, surrounding him from every angle. It wasn't coming from any animal, and it wasn't natural. It was almost human. He kept walking, deeper and deeper, until the campsite was out of sight. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the ground. And then, suddenly, the whistle stopped. The silence was worse than the sound had been. Alex stood still, his breath quickening. He spun around, unsure of where he was. The trail had vanished, and the woods stretched endlessly in every direction. His heart raced. The whistle started again, but this time it was close. Too close. The ground beneath his feet was soft, damp with dew, and as he took another step, he saw it. A cabin, half crumbling, hidden in the shadows between the trees. The wood was old, gray, and weathered, and vines curled around the walls like the fingers of some ancient beast. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking slightly as if inviting him in. Alex wasn't sure why, but something pulled him forward. His curiosity was a thick weight in his chest. He pushed the door open with a low groan and stepped inside. The air was stale. The scent of mildew and dust thick in the air. The room was bare, except for a few broken pieces of furniture and a fireplace long abandoned. But then, something caught his eye. A worn watch lying on the floor, as if it had been dropped there recently. He bent down to pick it up, but the moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, the whistling stopped. And then, everything went silent, except for the sound of footsteps. Alex froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was walking right behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. Only the darkness, the oppressive weight of the forest closing in. He started to back away, but the footsteps continued, closer now, and the sound of the whistling began again. Louder, stronger, more insistent. And then he saw it. A shadow in the doorway. A figure standing just out of reach, half hidden in the dim light. It was tall, gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. He didn't have time to react. The figure stepped forward, and in the blink of an eye, the whistling became deafening. It was coming from everywhere now, swirling around him, drowning out everything else. The figure's lips parted, and with a final shrill note, the sound stopped. Alex screamed, but it was too late. When Sarah and Ben found the cabin hours later, there was no sign of Alex. Only the watch still lying in the dirt, and the sound of whistling, faint and eerie, carried on the wind. They called for him, but the woods stayed silent, and every year after that, the whistling would return. Louder, closer, watching, waiting for the next soul to wander too far, and like Alex, none would return. The whistler never truly left the Smokies. He was always watching, always waiting, and he always whistled. Story number 3. The Mirror Lake, Lake Tahoe National Park. The drive to Lake Tahoe had been long, the sun beating down as they wound through the winding mountain roads. But once they got to the cabin, a remote little place tucked away on the shore of the lake, everything felt worth it. The cabin was cozy, surrounded by towering pine trees, with the shimmering surface of Lake Tahoe just a short walk away. A perfect place for a weekend getaway. A break from the city, a chance to relax and recharge. Dan, his wife Rachel, and their 2 kids, Lily and Ben, were eager to get settled. The kids ran around the cabin, claiming rooms and throwing their bags carelessly on the beds. Rachel was already unpacking in the kitchen, humming softly as she set things out for dinner, while Dan stood on the porch, staring out at the water. Lake Tahoe, with its deep blue waters, was famous for its beauty, its clarity. The kind of place you could stare at for hours and still not see everything. But something about the lake felt off. It was too quiet, almost too still. No boats, no sounds of the usual wildlife, just the occasional rustling of the trees and the slow, gentle lapping of water against the shore. As the day turned to evening, the family settled around the cabin's fire pit, laughing, sharing stories. The sky above them was darkening, but there was still a soft glow reflecting off the lake, almost like it was alive with a secret. But it was when Rachel went down to the water's edge, just as the last light of day was fading, that things started to feel strange. She leaned over the dock, gazing into the water. The reflection of the trees, the cabin, the mountains. It was perfect, almost too perfect. But there was something wrong with her reflection. It didn't match her movements exactly. Her image seemed to linger a fraction of a second too long, as if it were waiting for something. Rachel blinked and stepped back. Her heart skipped a beat. "Dan," she called, her voice tight. "Come here, you've got to see this." Dan stood up from the fire, walking toward her, his steps slow. "What is it?" he asked, his voice light, thinking it was just a trick of the light. But when he saw the water, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. He didn't see just Rachel's reflection. He saw a figure standing next to her, just beyond the edge of the dock, tall, with dark eyes that seemed to pierce through him. The figure was almost like a shadow, but not quite. It was part of the water, and yet it wasn't. It didn't belong. The figure wasn't moving, but its presence was unmistakable. Dan's stomach churned. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Rachel's eyes were wide. "Yes, what is that?" Before Dan could answer, the reflection of Rachel in the water began to twist, distorting. It wasn't her anymore. It was someone else, someone he didn't recognize standing in the water. The figure's face was pale, almost ghostly, and its eyes, they were empty, black, dark as the depths of the lake. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The water returned to its calm, serene state. Dan turned to Rachel, his voice shaky. "We need to get inside, now." The next few days passed uneventfully, but the strange feeling lingered. The lake, always so beautiful, now felt like something to fear. Every time Rachel or Dan glanced at the water, it seemed to call to them, beckoning them with a promise of something they couldn't understand. That night, as the family settled into bed, the whistling of the wind outside became a soft, eerie hum, like a voice in the dark. Dan drifted into an uneasy sleep, but was soon woken by a sound. Soft, almost indistinguishable, but there. A whisper. Dan, Rachel, Ben, Lily. It was their names, spoken one by one, in a voice that wasn't their own. Dan shot up in bed, his heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. He could hear Rachel stirring next to him, her breath quick and shallow. Ben and Lily were quiet in the other room. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Rachel nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "It's coming from the lake." Dan stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He walked to the window, heart racing, but when he looked out, there was nothing. Just the lake, glimmering softly in the moonlight. But as he stared, he could see movement just beneath the surface, like shadows moving through the water, swirling in strange patterns. Then he heard it again. Dan, Rachel, Ben, Lily. It was closer now, coming from the water, but the voices weren't coming from the shore. They were coming from the center of the lake, as if the lake itself was calling them by name. Dan's blood ran cold. He turned to Rachel, his mouth dry. "We have to leave, now." But Rachel wasn't listening. She was standing at the door, her hand on the knob, her eyes wide and distant. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice like someone else's. "I have to see what's out there." Before Dan could stop her, she opened the door and walked out into the night, her steps slow and deliberate, like she was in a trance. "Rachel, no!" Dan shouted, running after her. But when he reached the shore, he stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the water, was her reflection. Except it wasn't Rachel anymore. It was someone else, someone old, their face twisted and pale. And behind her, something else emerged from the water, a dark figure, its eyes empty, its mouth moving as it whispered her name. "Rachel!" Dan screamed, but she didn't respond. Her reflection smiled at him, and the figure behind her began to rise from the lake, its form growing larger, more solid with each passing second. Rachel turned, her eyes wide and empty, her face now pale and drawn. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice distant. "It's so peaceful here." Dan tried to pull her back, but the water reached up, pulling her in. And with that, the reflection changed again. This time, it was him, standing in the water, staring back at himself with eyes that weren't his own. The lake was silent once again, but the whispers were still there, echoing in the stillness, calling to him. They never stopped. The family was never seen again. The lake, clear and calm, remained unchanged. But if you stand on the shore at night, you can still hear the whispers. You can still see their reflections, trapped beneath the surface, waiting for the next family to come too close. Story number 4. The Forest of Echoes, Olympic National Park. The rain had been coming down in sheets for days, turning the forest floor into a slick, muddy mess. Olympic National Park, known for its ancient trees and dense fog, had always felt a little eerie, but today it felt worse. The trees seemed to stretch higher than usual, their gnarled branches twisting like dark arms reaching out of the mist. Park rangers Rick, Maria, and David were out on a routine patrol, a task they'd done 100 times before. They had been to the edges of the park, the well-traveled paths, and had seen it all. No surprises, no real danger. But today, something was different. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. And the deeper they went into the park, the quieter it became. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you'd expect in the woods. This was a dead silence, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "You ever notice how quiet it gets in here?" Maria asked, her voice carrying an edge of unease as she glanced around at the looming trees. Rick, the most experienced of the three, nodded slowly. "It's the Forest of Echoes. Locals talk about it. Strange things happen in there, voices, whispers, and that kind of stuff." David, the youngest, shrugged, not buying into the superstitions. "Sounds like ghost stories to me. I've been working this park for 5 years, and I've never heard anything odd." But even as he said it, He looked around uneasily, as though the trees were staring back at him. The wind rustled the leaves above, but there was no other sound, no birds, no animals, nothing but the steady thrum of his own heartbeat in his ears. They were only supposed to check a few of the old markers in the park, so they pressed on, following the trail deeper into the forest. It was when they reached the grove that the air seemed to change. The trees here were different, older, more twisted, their bark dark and cracked. The path they had been following seemed to disappear, swallowed up by the dense growth. It was here, in this small clearing, that they first heard it, a voice. Maria froze, looking around, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rick squinted into the shadows between the trees. "I didn't hear anything." But then it came again, louder this time, almost like it was right behind them. "Maria," the voice said, soft but unmistakable. Maria spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Did you hear that? It said my name." David rolled his eyes. "Okay, now you're scaring me." But even he looked around nervously, his eyes scanning the trees. "It's probably just the wind or some animal." But before he could finish his sentence, the voice came again. And this time, it wasn't just Maria's name, it was Rick's and David's. And then, in a tone so familiar, it sent chills down their spines, it whispered, "Rick, Maria, David." The three rangers stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests. Each time the wind blew, the trees seemed to whisper, carrying the voices, familiar voices, voices from their pasts. "It's not just the wind," Maria whispered, her face pale. "It's something else. Something wrong." As the whispers grew louder, the air thickened, pressing in on them like a weight they couldn't escape. The voices were no longer just echoes, they were memories, vivid and painful, rising from deep within each of them. Rick saw his brother, lying on the cold pavement, blood staining the road. He saw himself standing there, helpless, watching as the life drained from his brother's eyes. He heard the voice of his mother, sobbing, blaming him for the accident. Maria heard the laughter of her little girl, the sound of her daughter running through the house, only to be followed by the awful silence of a phone call that told her there had been an accident, a car crash, and her daughter was gone. The voice of her husband, pleading with her to come back, to leave the job, to leave the forest, but she hadn't listened. And now she was here, in the place where she had lost everything. David was younger, but he had his own regrets. He remembered a promise he made to his father before he died, a promise that he would take care of his mother. But David had left. He had run off to become a park ranger, chasing something that didn't exist, abandoning his mother when she needed him the most. Each of them was trapped, alone with the memories they had spent years trying to bury. The trees seemed to grow taller, closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, as though they were watching, waiting. The whispers continued to grow louder, louder, until the words became an unbearable roar. "Rick, Maria, David, you can't escape." They tried to run, but the forest closed in on them, the trees shifting, the paths twisting in impossible ways. No matter which direction they went, they couldn't escape. The whispers followed them, and with every step the voices grew more insistent, more angry. You left them. You abandoned them. The forest was no longer just a place. It was alive, pulsing with memories, with sins, with regrets. The echoes of their pasts surrounded them, forcing them to face the darkness they had buried inside for so long. Hours passed, maybe days, maybe only minutes, and the three rangers found themselves on their knees, the weight of their pasts bearing down on them, suffocating them. They no longer cared about finding a way out. There was no way out. The forest of echoes had them now, and the whispers would never stop. The next morning, a search party arrived, but they found nothing. The forest had swallowed the rangers whole. The only sign that they had been there were the faint echoes, still ringing in the trees, calling their names. And as the wind blew through the leaves, the voices continued to whisper, forever lost in the forest of echoes. Story number 5. The Black Oak, Acadia National Park. It was late autumn when Ben Adams first heard about the Black Oak. A seasoned photographer, Ben had spent years capturing the wild beauty of national parks, always searching for that perfect shot, that image that would stand out. Acadia National Park in Maine was one of the last places on his list. He'd heard the stories, of course. Every park had its local legends, but this one, the tale of the Black Oak, intrigued him more than most. Some people said it was cursed, that the oak was alive in some way, that it could control the minds of those who got too close. Other locals told of strange disappearances, lost hikers who wandered too near and never returned. But Ben, a man of reason, scoffed at such superstitions. He was a photographer, not a fool. There was beauty in the tree, that much was certain, and Ben was determined to capture it. The Black Oak stood alone on a small hill, its twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The tree was as black as coal, its bark smooth and almost shiny, as though it had been polished by some unseen hand. It was a striking image, one that made Ben's fingers itch to take his camera and snap a picture. He had to get closer, but as he approached, something felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a pressure that made his skin prickle. He paused, setting down his gear, trying to shake the unease that settled over him. The ground around the oak was unusually quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing, the wind had died down, and the usual rustling of the trees was absent. It was like the world had gone still, just for him. Ben shook his head. It was just his imagination. After all, this was a well-known spot for photographers. People came here all the time for the perfect shot. He raised his camera and began to take pictures, the lens focusing on the intricate details of the oak's bark and the way its branches twisted against the gray sky. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt drawn to it. At first, it was just a vague sensation, like a pull in the pit of his stomach. But then, as he focused more on the tree, it became clearer. It was as if the oak itself was watching him, its twisted roots creeping beneath the earth, curling toward him in some strange, sinister way. He took a step back, unsettled, but the sensation only grew stronger. It wasn't just his imagination anymore. Something in the tree was alive. Ben tried to walk away, but his feet wouldn't move. It was like the ground was holding him in place, like the roots of the tree were sinking deeper into the earth, pulling him closer. His heart began to race. He turned quickly and started to move in the opposite direction, but when he looked up, the oak was right there in front of him again, just as it had been before. It didn't make sense. He had walked away, he had crossed the hill. There was no way he should be back here. His pulse quickened as he looked around. Everything was wrong. The trees that had once surrounded him now seemed distant, as if they were fading into the background. The oak stood in the foreground, more imposing than ever. It was as though it had always been there, and everything else, the whole forest, had been an illusion. "Get it together, Ben," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. This couldn't be happening. He had to be tired. Or maybe it was just the isolation of the place playing tricks on him. He turned to leave again, and this time he forced himself to walk away with purpose. But after what felt like only a few steps, he heard it, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. When he turned around, the black oak was there again, just there. His breath caught in his throat. His head was spinning now, his vision blurring at the edges. He tried to run. He had to get away. But the harder he tried, the more he felt the oak's presence pulling at him, dragging him back. It was suffocating, like an invisible weight pressing down on him from all sides. With every step he took, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. The air seemed to thicken, and the whispers, he wasn't sure if they were real or just in his head, began. At first they were faint, like a breeze stirring the leaves, but then they grew louder, clearer, his name. The tree was calling him by name. "Ben! Ben!" the whisper seemed to say, low and almost loving. The voice was wrong. It wasn't human. In a panic, Ben dropped to his knees, clutching his head. His breath came in short gasps, the world spinning around him. He could feel the tree now, deep within his mind, its roots reaching into his thoughts, twisting them. They were in there, those roots, inside of him. Ben screamed, trying to pull himself away from the force that was overtaking his mind. He clawed at his temples, his nails digging into his skin. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He could feel the oak's cold fingers inside his skull, probing, searching. Then, in the midst of his madness, the truth hit him. The tree wasn't just alive, it was feeding off him, off his fear, off his sanity. The black oak was alive, and it had been waiting for someone like him, someone with the curiosity to get too close. It had a life of its own, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Not until it had what it wanted. With one last desperate act, Ben tried to break free. His hands dug into the earth, and with all his remaining strength, he began to pull up the roots of the tree. The ground gave way beneath him, and the roots came loose in his hands. As he dug deeper, he uncovered something dark, something far worse than he could have imagined. The black oak wasn't just a tree, it was a prison, a trap for souls. Those who wandered too close were not just drawn in by its twisted beauty, they were being consumed. The tree had been fed by the lives it claimed, its roots sucking up the spirits of those who had dared to approach. Ben's vision blurred as he uncovered the final truth. The black oak wasn't just cursed. It was a gateway, a living portal to something far darker, something that fed off those who approached, one soul at a time. As he clawed at the dirt, trying to escape, the whispers came again, louder than ever, and the ground beneath him shifted. The roots tightened around his legs, dragging him deeper into the earth. The last thing Ben saw before the darkness took him was the black oak, its branches reaching down like hands, waiting to take him, body and soul. And then, everything went silent. The tree had claimed him, just like it had claimed so many before him. The black oak stood as dark and twisted as ever, its roots now firmly entrenched in the earth, feeding on the souls of the lost. Story number 6. The Wraith of Shenandoah, Shenandoah National Park. The night air was cool, and the stars above Shenandoah National Park twinkled in a way that made the whole sky feel alive. The group of friends had been planning this trip for months. They were all experienced hikers, the kind who weren't afraid of much. Certainly not ghost stories. But there was one legend about the park that everyone had heard at some point or another: the Wraith of Shenandoah. It was said that a ghostly figure roamed the trails at night, her long black hair flowing in the wind, her pale face hidden beneath the shadows of the trees. Some said she had been a young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. Others claimed she was an old spirit, forever tied to the land. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that anyone who encountered her never came back. Most of the locals treated the story as just that, a story. But for Mark, Grace, Sarah, and Jake, the group of friends who had come to hike the park for the weekend, it was the perfect challenge. They weren't afraid of legends. In fact, they were eager to prove it was nothing more than a myth. "We'll hike the trails tonight," Mark said, his voice filled with excitement as they set up camp. "We'll go out at midnight. If we see anything, we'll take a picture. If not, we'll have one hell of a story to laugh about when we get back." The others agreed. They gathered their gear, flashlights, cameras, and the usual hiking supplies, and set out into the woods as the moon rose high. The air grew cooler as they walked deeper into the park, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the trail. The wind whispered through the leaves, making everything feel a little too quiet, a little too still. The deeper they went, the less they talked. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow distant, swallowed by the thick air. Mark led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but even with the light, it felt as though the woods were closing in on them. It was quiet, too quiet. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Grace and Jake fell silent, their eyes darting around, but Mark kept walking, not wanting to seem spooked. "Probably just an animal," he said, though even his voice had lost some of its usual confidence. But then, there it was again, an unmistakable sound, a soft rustling, like something moving in the brush. But it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too slow. It felt unnatural. The sound seemed to be moving with them, always just out of sight. They stopped walking, frozen, and turned their heads, listening. Then they saw it. A figure. A woman standing just beyond the trees, her long black hair flowing in the wind. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching them. Jake let out a nervous laugh, his voice breaking the tension. "Okay, this is just a joke, right? One of you put on a wig or something?" But there was no joke. The woman didn't respond. She only stood there, staring at them, her face hidden in the darkness, her presence like a shadow cast over the group. The temperature seemed to drop as the wind picked up, the air suddenly thick with a coldness that made their breath fog up in front of them. "What the hell is that?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Mark said, his hand gripping the flashlight tighter, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to leave, to turn around and run, but his legs wouldn't move. Suddenly, the woman stepped forward, gliding silently across the ground. The hair that blew in the wind seemed to move of its own accord, almost as though it had a life of its own. The air around her grew colder, and the forest fell completely silent. Not a single bird, not a single rustle in the trees. Only the sound of her breath, slow and steady as she approached. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice a low, echoing breath that sent shivers down their spines. "You have come for me, but I will take you first." And with those words, the world seemed to shift. The forest around them twisted, like the trees themselves were bending in unnatural ways. The ground under their feet felt like it was pulling them down, a deep, unshakable pull that seemed to drag at their very souls. Mark's eyes widened as the woman's face became clearer in the dim light, and he could see it now. The darkness in her eyes, the hollow, empty void that looked right through him. She wasn't just a ghost. She was something worse, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. The air returned to its normal temperature and the forest seemed to return to its usual quiet. But something was wrong. Very wrong. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice panicked. But when they tried to turn around, the trail was no longer where it had been. The trees seemed to have shifted, and the path that had once led them forward now led them back the way they came. They were trapped, caught in a loop they couldn't escape. "No," Sarah said, her voice shaking. This isn't right. This is her doing. She's trapped us here." Suddenly, the woman's voice echoed again, louder this time, closer. "You are mine now," she whispered, her voice filling their minds, squeezing the breath from their lungs. "You will never leave." Panic set in as they tried to run, but the forest didn't let them. The trees seemed to grow closer, the shadows longer, the path always just out of reach. The wraith wasn't just haunting the park. She was drawing them in, pulling them closer, until there was no escape. And as the night grew darker, they realized the truth. They hadn't come to prove a legend wrong. The legend had been waiting for them all along. One by one, the friends disappeared into the darkness, their souls claimed by the wraith, trapped forever in the shadows of Shenandoah. The next morning, park rangers found the abandoned camp and the forgotten gear scattered across the ground. But the friends were never seen again. Only the wind, whispering through the trees, carried the faintest echoes of their names. And deep within the woods, the wraith of Shenandoah waited, always waiting, for the next group of fools who would wander too close. Story number 7. The Ghost Bear, Glacier National Park. James Foster had always dreamed of hiking through the rugged, untouched wilderness of Glacier National Park. He'd seen the pictures, heard the stories, and it all seemed like an adventure he couldn't pass up. So, he packed his gear, grabbed his backpack, and set out alone, determined to conquer the wild for a few days. It was supposed to be a peaceful trip, a chance to get away from the noise of the world and connect with nature. But from the moment he stepped into the park, something felt off. The first day had been perfect. The weather was clear, the trails were manageable, and the scenery was more beautiful than he could have imagined. But by the second day, the clouds had begun to gather in the distance, dark and threatening. James wasn't worried at first. He was an experienced hiker, used to unpredictable weather. But as the wind began to pick up and the temperature dropped, he knew he needed to find shelter fast. He was miles from the nearest town, and the closest place he knew of was an old ranger station, abandoned but still standing. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best shot at staying safe through the storm that was quickly rolling in. By the time he reached the ranger station, the snow had already started to fall, soft at first, but soon turning into a blizzard. The wind howled through the trees, and James couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. His breath came in visible puffs, and his fingers were numb as he fumbled to open the door. The station was small but sturdy, and the wood creaked under the weight of the storm outside. Inside, the place smelled musty and old, but it was dry and sheltered, and that was all James needed. He dropped his pack and lit a fire in the small stove, trying to shake the chill from his bones. He'd been alone before, but this time, there was something unsettling about the silence. The wind screamed against the walls, but beyond that, the world outside felt unnervingly still. It wasn't long before James began to feel the eyes on him. At first, it was just a vague sensation, like being watched from the shadows. He dismissed it, telling himself it was the isolation playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it, the crunch of snow underfoot, faint but unmistakable, coming from just outside the cabin. James froze. He'd left the door shut tight, and the storm outside should have kept anything from wandering too close. Yet the sound was there, slow, deliberate footsteps, as though something was pacing around the cabin. He stood up, heart pounding, and crept to the window, peering out into the blizzard. Through the swirling snow, he thought he saw something large and dark moving just beyond the trees. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the snow blinded him, and the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared. A chill ran down his spine, and he backed away from the window. The last thing he wanted was to confront whatever was out there. But the footsteps continued, circling the cabin, growing closer with each passing minute. James sat back down, his breath coming faster, his nerves fraying. He tried to convince himself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a wolf, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. It was something else, something bigger, something that shouldn't be out there. The wind howled louder, and suddenly the cabin shook with a loud thud. James shot to his feet, his heart racing. The door rattled violently as if something huge was slamming against it from the outside. Then, silence. Only the storm remained, but the silence felt wrong, like it was waiting for something. Then, it came again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, it wasn't just outside the cabin, it was inside his mind. A deep, guttural growl echoed through his head, low and rumbling, a sound that made his teeth rattle. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The growl was growing louder, closer. With a trembling hand, James grabbed his flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the door. His breath fogged in the cold air as he slowly turned the handle. The door opened with a creak, and James stepped out into the storm, the wind howling around him like a living thing. The snow whipped at his face, blurring his vision, but he saw it then, the shadow of something enormous, standing at the edge of the forest. Its eyes glowed faintly in the storm, red and bright, like two burning embers. The figure was massive, its shape barely visible through the swirling snow, but it was there, its form outlined against the darkness. The creature's eyes locked with his, and a surge of panic rushed through James. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The bear, if that's what it was, took a slow step forward, and then another, each movement deliberate and heavy. James could feel the ground tremble beneath him as the bear's paws sank into the snow. It was no ordinary bear. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural. Its fur was like smoke, like shadows swirling in the storm, and its body seemed to flicker in and out of sight, as though it wasn't fully there. Its eyes, those glowing red eyes, bore into him, pulling him in, filling his mind with images of death and decay. The growl that had been in his head now filled the air around him, shaking the earth with its power. James tried to move, tried to run, but it was as if the very land itself was holding him in place. The bear was more than a creature of flesh. It was a spirit, an ancient force tied to the mountains, to the land, to something far older than he could comprehend. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, but the bear didn't answer. It didn't need to. The moment it stepped forward, James knew he was marked. He was the next victim. With one final, thunderous growl, the bear lunged. James didn't scream. There was no time. The cold darkness swallowed him whole, and the storm claimed his soul, just like it had claimed the souls of those who had come before him. And the ghost bear remained, stalking the land, watching for the next soul to claim. Its eyes would glow in the night, waiting for the unwary to wander too close. And then, the hunt would begin again. Story number 8. The Phantom Lights, Yellowstone National Park. For years, the strange lights had been a local legend. Glowing orbs that appeared in the fields just after dusk, dancing through the air like fireflies, but bigger, brighter, and far more mysterious. Park rangers whispered about them in hushed tones. Tourists talked about them with excitement, but no one really knew what they were. Some said they were an optical illusion, a trick of the light, while others insisted they were something far more sinister. Whatever they were, the lights always appeared in the same place, just outside the usual hiking trails, far from the park's most popular attractions. Tara and Mark had heard the stories from their fellow tourists. They were visiting Yellowstone for the first time, eager for an adventure, and when they'd learned about the lights, they couldn't resist the temptation. They were thrill seekers, always chasing the next big story, the next mystery to solve. They'd been hiking all day, enjoying the beauty of the park, but as the sun began to set and the sky turned orange and pink, they set their sights on the glowing lights in the distance. "I bet it's just some campfire or something," Mark said, his voice full of skepticism. "Nothing to be afraid of." Tara didn't answer. She was already pulling out her camera, eager to get a picture of whatever it was. She had always believed in the unexplained, loved the idea that there were things out there in the world that couldn't be easily explained. The thought of capturing something mysterious excited her more than anything. As they made their way toward the lights, the air seemed to grow colder. The evening breeze picked up, swirling around them, making the trees creak and sway. The last traces of sunlight were fading, and the lights ahead grew brighter, moving in strange patterns. They didn't seem to follow any particular path. Sometimes they hovered in place, other times they darted to the left, only to disappear and reappear somewhere else. Mark's sense of excitement began to fade, replaced by an uneasy feeling in his stomach. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, his eyes scanning the growing darkness around them. Tara, though, was undeterred. She pushed forward, convinced the lights were some rare, natural phenomenon, a chance to make an amazing discovery. "Come on, don't be a baby," she teased, though her voice was shaky too. The deeper they went into the park, the thicker the trees grew, and the shadows around them seemed to stretch and grow longer. The lights were now directly in front of them, so close they could see the way they flickered, like candles in the wind. They followed the lights for what felt like hours, but the path they were on seemed to twist and wind in ways that didn't make sense. The field they had started in was now far behind them, replaced by thick woods and uneven ground. Tara's excitement had faded into a gnawing sense of confusion. She checked her phone for a signal, but there was nothing, no service. Mark turned back to look at the way they had come, but the trail behind them was no longer visible. The lights, still hovering in the distance, seemed to be leading them further away from civilization, further into the unknown. "Maybe we should turn back," Mark said, his voice tense. Tara shook her head, but she couldn't deny the sense of dread creeping over her. "Just a little further," she insisted, even as her feet dragged in the deepening dark. They didn't realize how far they had gone until the lights stopped moving. They had finally reached the source. The clearing was wide, the grass tall and wild, and in the center the lights hovered, dimming one by one. The air was heavy, suffocating. It was as if they had crossed into a place that didn't belong in this world. Tara looked around, her heart racing. "Mark, this place feels wrong." Suddenly, a voice broke the silence, a whisper, low and familiar. "Tara." The voice sounded like her own, but it was strained, distant. She turned, but saw no one. "Mark, did you hear that?" she asked, her voice cracking. Mark didn't respond. He was staring at the lights, which had begun to flicker erratically, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "Tara," he said slowly, "we need to leave. Right now." But before they could turn back, the lights flared brightly, blinding them for a moment. When their vision cleared, the lights were no longer alone. Figures emerged from the darkness, faint and ghostly, hovering near the ground. They were people who looked like they had been wandering for years, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish. "Mark, we need to go," Tara said, her voice trembling. But the figures didn't move. They just stared at them, silent, their eyes hollow and lost. One of the figures, an older man, stepped forward, his face gaunt, his skin pale and stretched over his bones. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a low, mournful wail filled the air. Mark stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. Tara grabbed his arm, pulling him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figures. They weren't real, they couldn't be, but they were, and they were drawing closer. Suddenly, the truth hit him with the force of a freight train. The lights weren't a natural phenomenon, they weren't some trick of the mind. The lights were the souls of those who had vanished into Yellowstone, the ones who had followed the lights, thinking they were safe, only to become lost in the dark. And now, the lights were calling to them. Mark tried to run, but it was too late. The figures surrounded them, their hands reaching out, their fingers like ice. As the lights flickered and pulsed, the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with memories, with voices of the lost. The last thing Mark saw was the figure of a woman, her face twisted in pain, reaching out to him. And then everything went black. The next morning, rangers found their abandoned gear and the faint imprint of footprints leading into the woods. But there was no sign of Tara or Mark. The lights still danced across the fields of Yellowstone just after dusk, as they always had. And those who wandered too close, those who followed the lights, were never seen again. They, too, would become part of the haunting glow, cursed to wander in the dark for all eternity. Story number 9. The Silent Watchers, Everglades National Park. The Everglades had always been a place of mystery. For centuries, people had avoided the vast wetlands, with its dense, murky waters and thick swamp. It was a place where the land seemed to breathe with its own rhythm, where the air felt heavy, and the silence was suffocating. Most people came for the adventure, but only the bravest stayed. Stories had been passed down, legends whispered in the dark corners of bars about the creatures that lived beneath the swamp. The Silent Watchers, they were called, ancient beings that lurked beneath the waters, watching those who dared to enter. But no one had ever proven these stories to be true. Not until now. A group of explorers, young, eager, and determined to make their mark, had set out to chart the deepest parts of the Everglades. They were led by Ben, an experienced guide who had spent years working in the park, and his younger brother Alex, who had grown up hearing about the dangers of the Everglades but never fully believed them. They were joined by a few other explorers: Mia, a photographer, Liam, an amateur biologist, and Rachel, a wildlife enthusiast. The group was excited. They had all heard the stories, but none of them were prepared for the truth. The first few days of their journey went smoothly. The air was thick with humidity, the bugs relentless, but they didn't mind. They joked around, taking pictures of the landscape, documenting rare species, and making campfires in the evening. They were too busy to notice the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the way the swamp seemed quieter, the way the trees seemed to lean closer, as though the land was watching them. It was on the third night that things began to feel off. They had set up camp near an old, rotting dock, the planks barely visible beneath the dense growth of moss and vines. Ben had warned them to be careful around the water. Strange things happened in these parts, he said. Things that even he couldn't explain. They laughed it off, thinking he was just being cautious. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness spread across the swamp, the air grew still. Too still. Mia, who was sitting by the fire, noticed it first. The silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of the swamp, where the croak of frogs and the rustle of leaves filled the air. This silence was different. She glanced around at the others. They were talking, but she couldn't hear the usual hum of insects, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. It was as if the swamp itself had stopped breathing. "Ben," Mia said softly, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" Ben looked up from the map he was studying. He frowned, listening carefully. "It's too quiet," he said, standing up. "It's not right." The rest of the group grew uneasy. Liam stood up to check their gear, Rachel nervously adjusting the straps on her backpack. They all felt it now, the eerie stillness pressing in on them, the weight of something unseen. Then they saw it, a flicker in the water. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible in the dark. Ben was the first to move toward it, a sense of curiosity tugging at him. But before he could take a step, there was a low, guttural sound. A kind of growl, though it didn't come from any animal they knew. Ben stopped. His eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The water shifted again, and there, just beneath the surface, something moved. Something large, but it was too dark to make out clearly. A shape, stretching and contracting like it was alive. It was watching them. Without a word, the group froze. The air was thick now, heavy with an unseen pressure. The water rippled gently, but there was no breeze to stir the trees, no sound of insects, no rustling of leaves, just the stillness. And then, it happened. A figure appeared. No, it was more like a shadow, a blur, just at the edge of their vision. It was moving swiftly, impossibly fast, disappearing the moment they tried to focus on it. Ben's heart raced. His instincts screamed at him to move, to get the hell out of there. "Get to the boat," he snapped, his voice rough with panic. "Now!" But as they scrambled toward the boat, the silence followed them. No footsteps in the mud, no rustle in the leaves, only the sound of their frantic breathing. They pushed through the dense foliage, the swamp now feeling more like a maze that wouldn't let them escape. They were being watched, but they couldn't see from where. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The air wasn't as thick, the silence wasn't as heavy. The group looked at each other, confused, unsure of what had just happened. They hadn't heard anything, no growls, no footsteps, no shifting water. But they could feel it, the invisible eyes that had been upon them. They made it to the boat and pushed off into the water, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. But the sense of being watched never left them. They paddled, but the swamp seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around them. The water was thick with shadows, and no matter how fast they rowed, the land seemed to be pulling them back. By the time they reached their campsite again, the feeling had only grown stronger. It was as if the land itself was pushing them back, forcing them to stay, to keep them in its grip. Then the second night came, and they saw the figures again. Shadows that flickered just out of their sight, too quick to focus on, but always there, always watching. The creatures, the silent watchers, were not a myth. They were real. One by one, the group started to feel the presence of the watchers more and more. They would catch glimpses of the creatures in the corners of their eyes, moving swiftly through the trees, flickering beneath the water, just beyond their reach. The watchers had awoken from their centuries-long slumber, and now they were stalking the explorers. Each time they tried to leave, the swamp pushed them back. The trees, the water, the land. It all seemed to be alive, a part of something ancient and terrifying. The creatures, the silent watchers, were marking them, pulling them closer to the heart of the Everglades, to the place where the boundary between life and death was thin as a whisper. The explorers didn't know it yet, but they were already marked. And in the darkness of the Everglades, the watchers were waiting. Story number 10. The Blood Moon of Joshua Tree National Park. Megan and Jason had been planning this trip for months. Joshua Tree National Park was a place of strange beauty, vast deserts, jagged rock formations, and those iconic twisted trees that looked like something from another world. But they weren't just coming for the scenery. The real reason they had chosen this weekend was the rare event that had drawn so many others to the park: the blood moon. It wasn't something that happened often. In fact, it was said that the blood moon only rose once every few years. It was a celestial phenomenon where the moon turned a deep red, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Megan had always been fascinated by the night sky, and Jason loved the idea of escaping the city for a weekend under the stars. They figured they'd be among the few lucky ones to witness this rare event. They arrived at Joshua Tree just as the sun was beginning to set. The park was quieter than they expected, and the desert felt strangely still. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, and the air felt thick, like something was waiting just beyond the horizon. After setting up their camp, they sat by the fire, joking and talking about everything and nothing. But as the night deepened, something began to change. The temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, whipping through the trees with a force that made the fire flicker. Megan felt uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint why. "I've never seen the sky so dark," she said, looking up at the stars. Jason, trying to ease her nerves, smiled. "It's just a blood moon, nothing to be afraid of." But Megan wasn't so sure. The atmosphere felt wrong, too quiet, too still. As the minutes ticked by, a sense of dread began to settle in. It wasn't the moon rising that made her uneasy, it was the way the desert seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Then the moon began to rise. At first, it was just a sliver of light, barely visible through the clouds. But as it ascended into the sky, it grew brighter, turning a deep, blood-red hue, casting an unnatural glow over the landscape. Megan and Jason both watched in awe as the red moon bathed the desert in a haunting light. But then something happened. The wind stopped. The trees went still. The desert seemed to go completely silent, as if the world had gone completely dark. No crickets, no animals, not even the rustling of wind through the dry grass. The silence felt like a weight, pressing down on them from all sides. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered, his eyes wide. Megan didn't answer. She was staring at something in the distance, a shape just beyond the reach of the firelight. She couldn't make it out, but she knew it was there. Something dark and shifting. Something that wasn't supposed to be in the desert. I don't know," Megan said, her voice shaking. "There's something out there." Jason stood up, looking into the darkness, but there was nothing. The desert stretched endlessly before them, silent and empty. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling creeping up his spine. "You're imagining things," but Megan wasn't so sure. As the minutes passed, the air around them grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The moon seemed brighter now, casting long shadows across the desert floor, making the rocks and trees look distorted like they were alive. And then it came. A whisper, a low, guttural voice carried on the wind. Megan's heart skipped a beat. It was too faint to make out the words, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was calling to them. "Megan," Jason said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, faint at first, like a distant earthquake, but then stronger, sending ripples through the desert sand. A crack appeared in the earth near their camp, a deep, jagged tear that spread wide, and from the crack, something emerged. At first, it was just a shadow, but it quickly took form. A figure, tall and hunched, cloaked in darkness, with eyes glowing red like embers. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its face was a twisted mask of emptiness, its body like a shadow that moved too smoothly, too unnaturally. The figure took a step forward, and with each step the ground seemed to shift beneath it. The desert was no longer just a place. It had become a portal, a doorway between worlds, and the creature that emerged was the one waiting for the blood moon to rise. "Jason," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that thing?" I don't know," Jason stammered, backing away, but the figure didn't stop. It was moving toward them, slow but deliberate, and behind it, the desert seemed to come alive. Dark shapes flickering just beyond the edges of their vision, whispering voices that echoed in their heads. The creature's voice rumbled through the air, ancient and hollow. "The blood moon, it is a signal, a door, and you are the offering." Megan grabbed Jason's arm, pulling him backward, but the creature followed, its red eyes never leaving them. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the very air grew thick with a sense of dread. The desert wasn't just a place anymore. It was a prison, a place where the boundary between life and death had thinned. They ran, but no matter how fast they moved, they couldn't escape the pull of the desert. The shadows closed in, and the creature's voice echoed louder, the whispers from the depths of the earth growing stronger. The blood moon hung high above them, casting a red light that seemed to burn into their souls. And they knew, no matter how far they ran, no matter how quickly they tried to escape, the desert had already claimed them. By the time the moon set, they were gone. In the days that followed, park rangers found their abandoned campsite, their gear left behind untouched. But the desert was silent once again, as if nothing had ever happened. And the blood moon, though it had set, left behind a lingering presence, a dark force that would wait patiently for the next to come. One who would stumble upon the desert's secret, just as Megan and Jason had. The portal between worlds never fully closed. It only waited